And I know that, the VA, particularly when looking at temporary ratings, is concerned about the near term. And lots of our veterans, when they come to us, are also concerned about, getting benefits as soon as possible and, what's going to happen in the next 6 months to a year.
Mm-hmm.
But keeping in mind the way the VA disability system works, what are some ways that veterans can prepare to play the long game that will get them lasting benefits under the system we're working in?
Sure. Well, despite folks' focus on the short-term benefits, usually the focus is going to be the same whether you're looking at the short-term or the long-term. The issue is always, first, proving connection to service, and second, proving the severity of the condition, and especially whether or not it impacts the ability to work in such a way that people can't continue to work full-time at a substantially gainful level.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA. If you're a veteran struggling with the VA's disability system or just want to make sure you're getting the benefits you've earned, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an update that could change your life. I'm Christian Terrison, here with renowned veterans disability attorney Francis Jackson of Jackson and MacNichol. Jack has dedicated his career to helping veterans like you win the benefits you deserve, recovering millions of dollars for thousands of heroes. This podcast isn't just for veterans navigating the system, though. It's for their families, their friends, and anyone else who wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who've served. So stick around, because we're here to make sure you get the support you need. So today's show is about temporary disability ratings. To sort of set the stage, temporary ratings, they often feel like placeholders. What's the real purpose behind them, and how should veterans think about their value?
Well, there are actually a couple kinds of temporary ratings. For purposes of the kind you were talking about just a second ago, they are placeholders. What the VA will often do is they will look at a claim and decide, okay, it's pretty clear this claim for service connection should be granted, but we don't have enough information to actually rate the claim, that is to say, to determine how severe it is and where it should fall on the percentile rating chart. So they will put in a temporary rating literally as a placeholder. That's kind of the most common type of temporary rating. The other temporary ratings that we see are, there's a specific provision for the VA to give people a temporary 100% rating when they're recovering from medical treatment, typically surgery, for a condition that's related to service or connected to service. And so you will sometimes see a person whose rating jumps from, say, 40 or 50% up to 100% for a period of time while they're recovering from surgery. One of the common examples is somebody has to have a knee replacement surgery, and their combined rating is, say, 60%, but because they're immobilized for a while following surgery, the VA gives them a temporary 100% rating until they recover.
Okay. So what's at risk for veterans with a temporary rating? Are we talking about the potential for missed benefits? I know that, as the name implies, the rating is temporary, so it would be reduced later on. What are the considerations there?
Well, it can be reduced or increased. It depends on what the situation is. Most commonly, what you'll see is the VA will put in either a non-compensable rating, a 0 rating, or a relatively low rating for a condition that they're unsure about, and then they'll develop the information to actually get what they think is the correct rating. It may not be the correct rating, but it's the one that they think is correct, at least based on the information they have at that point in time. So for example, you might see somebody get a 0% or a 10% rating, and then when the VA finishes working it up and gets a compensation and pension exam report or gets private records, whatever the information they need might be, then the rating would jump up to 50%, 60%. It just depends on the nature of the claim and the severity.
So for a veteran who's had the temporary increase, say for a knee surgery, as you mentioned, but then once the recovery period is over, once that temporary rating is set to expire, if their symptoms are still, at 100% limitation or at an increased limitation beyond what they would get otherwise, what are some things that veterans in that situation can do?
Well, the most important thing is to provide the medical information to the VA showing what the ongoing rating should be. One situation where this comes up a lot is veterans who have prostate cancer. What the VA will do is they will give the veteran typically a 100% rating for the period where the cancer is active. And then following either prostatectomy surgery or radiation that reduces or eliminates the cancer, then they will take away that 100% rating. But at that point in time, what they're supposed to do is to rate what are called the residuals, meaning the remaining effects on the body from the condition. And using my example of the prostate cancer, because it's one we see a lot, residuals would include things like frequent urination, having to wear adult diapers because of problems with urination. There are lots of possible problems. We won't go through them all, but you get the idea. And the critical thing, and this is really critical across the entire VA rating system, but especially in these post 100% situations, the critical thing is to get across to the VA the severity of the remaining symptoms. And so many veterans, unfortunately, are proud and don't want to admit to the level of difficulty they're having, don't want people to know that they're struggling, and they'll downplay their symptoms. The result will be that the VA will downplay the rating. It's critically important that people are really very clear about their ongoing symptoms. And it always amazes me. One of the things that happens a lot in hearings, the veteran will testify and he'll downplay his symptoms. And then we'll put the wife on and she'll say, it's really much worse than he admits. There's this and this and this and this. And it's always a little bit amusing to see the interplay there. But all humor aside, it really is important, critically important, to convey to the VA the severity of the symptoms in order to get the correct rating.
And I know when it comes to getting those correct ratings, veterans often hear, get more evidence, get more evidence, get more evidence. But I guess to go beyond the generic get more evidence, what sorts of things specifically should veterans be looking for to document those residual symptoms?
Well, it varies so much from claim to claim. There's no way to answer that generically. But the best thing you can do is to look at the VA's rating schedule. The VA has a published schedule of ratings for a whole long list of conditions. And when there's not a rating for the specific condition that the veteran has, they do what they call rating by analogy, meaning they take what they think is the closest condition in the rating table and they try to analogize to that. So, for example, if someone has radiculopathy radiating from their back down into their legs, down the sciatic nerve and so on, the VA will look at a what they call a comparable condition, which is severe or moderate paralysis of the nerves going down the leg. And so it becomes a question of looking at what are the conditions that are being rated, or what's the condition that's being looked to by analogy, and then look at, okay, the VA says at this level of symptoms that's a 10% rating, at this level it's a 30% rating, at this level it's a 50% rating. And it's necessary to just look at the symptoms, match those up to the medical records and the testimony, and make sure that the veteran explains that he or she has the particular symptoms that match up to the appropriate level of rating. So for diabetes, for example, there's an increase in rating if you have to be on insulin rather than oral medication. There's an increase in rating if you have your activities limited because of the diabetes. So it's just important to specifically look at the relevant rating and then tease out the symptoms and then show which of those symptoms exist. And that's one of the things that a VA disability attorney does in these rating increase or post-temporary rating kinds of situations, is to look at the symptoms. And it's important for people to understand the symptoms don't have to match exactly to any of the rating levels. What you're trying to do is to show that the more severe symptoms demonstrate a need for a higher level rating than the VA may have given in the temporary rating. If it was a 0 or 10%, you may well be entitled to a 30% rating or a 50% rating or a 70% rating. It just depends on the symptoms. And that's why it's just critically important to get, number one, medical records recording those symptoms, and number two, testimony talking about those symptoms at the hearing or in an affidavit.
And I know it's not going to make or break, for instance, opinion evidence, but could you talk a little bit about sort of the hierarchy of providers when it comes to opinion evidence? If you're having a
Sure.
knee issue, your orthopedist is going to carry more weight than a general practitioner type of thing.
Sure. The VA, with occasional exceptions, tends to rate the strength or validity or weight of opinions based upon the credentials of the person who's offering the opinion. So in your example, the orthopedic surgeon would probably carry the most weight as opposed to a nurse practitioner or a chiropractor or a massage therapist or whoever. So the kind of usual hierarchy is they would look to a specialist, they would look to someone who is a general practitioner or a specialist in a different area of medicine. They would look to a nurse practitioner, preferably with one with experience or specific credentials in that area, but again, that's the specialist versus generalist kind of weight issue. And it's kind of, you go down the level of medical expertise, the weight of the opinion drops. So if you have a nurse who's an LPN, he or she might not get as much weight for their opinion as an RN or a nurse practitioner. It's pretty much graduated along the lines of the level of specialization and presumably resulting knowledge about the condition.
And I know that can be a sticking point too when trying to overcome, for instance, a bad CMP exam. I know that I guess as a cost-saving measure, likely, I've seen a lot more physician's assistants and psychiatric nurse practitioners doing CMP exams as opposed to clinical psychologists or specialist
psychiatrists.
physicians.
Yep.
And so if you have a psychiatrist who's saying one thing and then there's a CMP from an LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker, that conflict, that can be important to point out.
It can. Yeah. Typically, if you're going to get a private opinion, you want to try to get one from someone with the greatest possible relevant credentials. The one caveat to that is that the treating physician, whether they're a specialist or not, someone who has long-term experience with you and your condition, may typically get more weight. Not always, but they may.
And I know that some veterans think that appealing a determination can be a gamble, but is it really? How can veterans challenge a bad rating determination?
Well, it can be a little bit of a gamble. There are times when people have gotten very favorable reports from C&P exams, and pushing the VA to really look hard at the condition may not be in the veteran's best interest. But generally speaking, 95% of the time, there is no downside to appealing. And I say 95% of the time, it's probably more like 99% of the time. But the point is that most of the time, appealing is potentially beneficial to the veteran and unlikely to do any harm. Once in a while, if there was some strange confluence of factors that got an unusually favorable report, then pursuing it may actually be detrimental. The VA may decide that really the rating should be lower. But that's extremely unusual and typically fairly easy to counter.
So this next question, usually when I'm thinking about questions, I can think of an example to answer from my own experience, but in this instance, I can't. I was wondering, what is the most surprising of the cases you've worked on that involves a temporary rating? Something where either the VA had, dropped the ball in a truly surprising manner, or something along those lines.
Well, I think it's probably most surprising is we had one a few years ago where the fellow was rated at 10% and made some other claims, and they lost the 10% rating entirely. They just lost it. When we got the file, we're working with him, going over it, we realized that he had this 10% rating that went back for years, and they had just stopped paying it. And there was no explanation, no ruling, no rating.
Just quietly.
They just lost it. So we went back and pointed out to them, excuse me, but he has a 10% rating for this, and you haven't been paying it for the last 7 years.
Wow.
So there are some strange things that happen, but it's just not something that happens very often.
So for veterans who have temporary disability rating, whether a temporary boost or a sort of placeholder rating, what is the one question they should be asking themselves in that temporary period?
Well, there are really two questions. One is, how far back should my rating go once I get the real rating as opposed to the temporary rating? Because that can sometimes be a problem. Sometimes the VA doesn't move the final rating back to the effective date of the temporary rating, so you have to pay attention to that. But the primary question is always, what do my symptoms justify as the correct level of rating, and how do I show that to the VA? And usually, as we mentioned, that's a question of medical records and then testimony about symptoms.
Okay. And I know that the VA, particularly when looking at temporary ratings, is concerned about the near term, and lots of our veterans, when they come to us, are also concerned about getting benefits as soon as possible, and what's going to happen in the next 6 months to a year. Mm-hmm. But keeping in mind the way the VA disability system works, what are some ways that veterans can prepare to play the long game that will get them lasting benefits under the system we're working in?
Sure. Well, despite folks' focus on the short-term benefits, usually the focus is going to be the same whether you're looking at the short term or the long term. The issue is always, first, proving connection to service, and second, proving the severity of the condition, and especially whether or not it impacts the ability to work in such a way that people can't continue to work full-time at a substantially gainful level. But the thing we kind of haven't touched on here yet is what the VA calls staged ratings, and that's kind of a series of temporary ratings, if you will, where the VA might get the claim today, and it takes them forever to get around to adjudicating it, and by the time they finally decide they should grant service connection, we're 3 years down the road. And they'll do what they call staged ratings, where they say, well, okay, we're going to service connect you, Mr. Jones, and we're going to give you 10% for that first 6-month period after you were service connected. And then we're going to raise you to 30% for the next year. And then we think, it's now gotten bad enough that we should raise you to 50% now. But what you have to do is sit down and look at it in terms of what really is the severity, what are the symptoms that are being recorded, and do those ratings correspond to the symptoms for the time periods that the VA imposed them. So it may turn out that when you go back and dig into it, really the symptoms haven't changed, and Mr. Jones really should have gotten 50% right from the date of the effective date, but the VA sometimes, as I said, uses these staged ratings, and so one of the things you have to analyze when you're meeting with a new client and starting to look at where they are is whether the current ratings should have been in effect all along, or whether the lower ratings that they had initially were appropriate based on the symptoms at the time.
And something I'd like to mention, just for any younger veterans who may be watching, or older folks who know and maybe see themselves in a stubborn younger veteran, getting that service connection element out of the way, there's no downside to applying as soon as you have an inkling that there is something wrong that's connected to service. I know I've personally worked on a few cases where somebody will get a 0% or a 10% service connection for a condition that, as they age, as the other related conditions crop up, as symptoms worsen, they don't have to fight that service connection element again. It becomes just about showing the symptoms' severity too.
That's really a critically important point. So many people who are eligible for service connection don't bother because they think, oh, this is something minor, and fail to recognize the risk that it's going to become much more severe over time. And so it is easier, generally, to prove service connection the closer in time you are to service, as opposed to 30 years down the road. So, as you said, it's really important for folks to put in for service connection as soon as they're aware that there is a service-connected condition, even if it gets a 0% or a 10% or other relatively low rating, because it will save a lot of difficulty in proving service connection when you're years down the road and the doctor that was treating you right after you left the service has died or retired, his records have been destroyed, all those sorts of things. I mean, on the news last night I was listening to comments on the news that a local hospital is closing, and just thinking about some of the difficulties we've had trying to retrieve medical records from hospitals that have closed over the years. It becomes a real challenge. So I can't agree more with your proposition that it's really important to get service connection as soon as possible, as early as possible. If the condition doesn't worsen, you're no worse off. But if it does, you're way ahead of the game.
All right. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but that was a great note to end on. Please be sure to like and subscribe and join us again next week.
Hope to see you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if If you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.